Transporting myself to another place has always been my favorite part of reading. From Witch Mountain to Middle Earth, from the courts of Elizabeth I to a racially divided Mississippi, my favorite authors have always painted a realistic picture of another world and inhabited it with people with whom I wanted to spend time. In The Paris Wife, the elegant novel by Paula McLain, I was thrilled to take a journey back to 1920s Paris, where Ernest Hemingway and his first wife, Hadley Richardson, moved into a two-room apartment next to a public dance hall. I got to watch as Ernest struggled with his craft and as Hadley struggled with her role as his wife. Through Paula's writing, I was a part of the lost generation, the expatriate community of artists and writers. Perhaps it's Paula's training as a poet, her MFA in poetry from the University of Michigan, that has helped her come up with such lovely, evocative phrases, such as Hadley's when Ernest asked her if she was in love with Paris. Hadley thinks, "I wasn't, not yet, but I was in awe of it." To walk the best streets in Paris just then was like having the curtained doors of a surreal circus standing open so you could watch the oddity and splendor at any hour. After the enforced austerity of the war, when the textile industry collapsed and the great couturiers nailed their doors shut, brightly colored silks now ran through the streets of Paris like water, Persian blues and greens, startling oranges and golds. Now that's somewhere I'd like to visit. Perhaps the time Paula spent at Yaddo and the McDowell's Writers' Colony, where she was able to live and work surrounded by other writers and artists, inspired her to write so vividly about Ernest and Hadley's experiences communing with the expatriate writers of the day. Ezra Pound and Dorothy Parker, Gertrude Stein and Alice Toklas, and Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald all offer their advice and friendship, and we get to know them as well as they mentor and befriend Ernest and Hadley. But she also must be an astute observer of human emotion, and that quality certainly helped Paula recognize and convey the intensity of the love between Ernest and Hadley. When they were together, no matter what choices or struggles they faced, they continued to return to each other, speaking their own special language. Paula makes us see that the innocence of their time together cast a glow on Hadley in Ernest's eyes his whole life. At the end of his life, he worked on his memoir, A Moveable Feast. As he looks back, he writes of Hadley, "I wished I had died before I ever loved anyone but her." Thank you, Paula, for transporting us into such a beautiful world. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Paula McLain. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm a little worried about noise, but we'll muddle through, right? And the heat. But it's beautiful. It's not raining today. We're all very happy. Yay! It's not raining. So from 1921 to 1926, when Ernest Hemingway was a very young man, he lived in Paris with his first wife, Hadley, a woman who for most of us is entirely unknown. Myself, I knew her not at all until I read Hemingway's memoir of his early years in Paris, A Moveable Feast, which I picked up quite by accident. If you don't know that book, as Robin just mentioned, it was published in 1964 after his death and written at the tail end of his life, and the story goes this way. When he was traveling in Paris in the mid-1950s, a good friend of his who worked at the Ritz Hotel said, "You might want to pop by here. I think we have some of your things." They had been doing some renovation, and in the basement of the hotel, they had found a trunk. And Ernest Hemingway was a notorious pack rat and a bit of a squirrel. The idea is that really once his hand touched a piece of paper, it belonged to him. This could be a candy wrapper or a 3-year-old newspaper. He really saved everything. He saved all of his correspondence. So when he went over to the Ritz Hotel and opened the trunk, lo and behold, these were his papers, these were his personal things, and in the trunk, among other things, were many, many sketches that he had written in Paris in the early 20s, which he had forgotten all about. He had forgotten that he had written these things, and then was deliciously kind of reintroduced to this time in his life, as if it was being lived again, and reintroduced to his first real love, my Hadley. And so when I was reading A Moveable Feast, Two things I think really struck me about that book. One is if you love Hemingway, it's this wonderful kind of insider view of his early literary biography. I mean, when he moved to Paris, he was 22 years old. He had done almost no writing at all. He had been writing ad copy for Firestone Tires in Chicago, you know, sending his stories to little literary magazines, kind of trying to beat down that door the way all aspiring writers try to do, which to me is kind of a hilarious thought, because you think, Ernest Hemingway, he must have just come out that way, right? He must have come out that writer that we know today so well. But in fact, that's not true at all. So as I'm reading A Moveable Feast, the other thing that really strikes me is the love story. So as Robin just mentions, he writes at the end of the book of Hadley, they were married for 5 years. We know that the man did not have a marvelous track record with love. He is married 3 other times after Hadley. So when he says that, when he says, I wished I had died before I ever loved anyone but her, it introduces a real poignancy, because you think, so what happened? What happened between these 2 young lovers? And that was my introduction to my research. I had all of these questions. My writer's mind started to tick. Who is Hadley Richardson? How did these young lovers meet? What was it like to be married to Ernest Hemingway? And before he was himself, before he was and had even become or begun to become the writer that we're all so familiar with today, perhaps the most famous writer of his generation. And so I went looking for biographies. I didn't even know if they existed or not. Hadley Richardson, who was this woman? So I went to the library, where you can find all good things. And lo and behold, there are 3 biographies of Hadley's life, and I went right over to one of the carols and cracked a spine, and the book fell open to an excerpt of one of her letters. And really, from the moment I read her voice, that was it. I mean, I fell madly in love, and I thought, this is my girl. I have to write this book. I absolutely have to write this book. There was something about, I don't know, her earnestness and her warmth, her generosity, her humor, her intelligence, that all kind of leapt off the page to me. So I devoured these biographies and went on to read other biographies of Hemingway's life. And I thought 2 things. One, Hadley Richardson for me was just an instantly compelling woman. I wanted to live in her skin. I wanted to occupy her brain, and I wanted to tell her life as she lived it. And I was willing to do any amount of research to get to that place. But also she does this very special thing, which is that she gives us a view on Ernest Hemingway that we haven't really seen before. His later life, his persona, the Ernest Hemingway that we know is Papa Hemingway, right? He's the later Hemingway. He's that old man of the sea. Have you seen that photograph of him in the fisherman's sweater? I love that photograph. But he's not my Hemingway. And I do feel very proprietary about this young man, because I was kind of married to him for a couple of years, because I wrote the book from Hadley's point of view. So it was if I got to know him the way that she did. It was if I began to fall in love with him the way that she did, and was very surprised to find, as I began to do more and more research about his life and about their love relationship, how much I liked him. That was a surprise to me, because I knew what you all know, right? He's an egomaniac, he's an alcoholic, maybe a misogynist, he hated his mother. You know, he goes on safari and he takes down these lions, and if he can't have the biggest lion, then he doesn't even want that old lion. I mean, he's enormously competitive. He loses friends right and left. And yet I really liked him. I liked him because I got to know him the way that Hadley did. So these 2 young lovers meet in 1920. In 1920, Hadley is 28 years old. And this is going to sound very silly to say, but if you're 28 years old in 1920, you're a spinster. She had really all but given up on life and love and happiness. And again, it sounds ridiculous to say, because now you're like a 28-year-old woman. She's not even half cooked, you know? What are you talking about, a spinster? And yet she really hadn't done much living, and she really didn't have much appetite or experience with happiness. She had a very dark, protected, cloistered early life. She grows up in St. Louis as part of an upper middle class family, and two things happen in her early life that mark her psychically, psychologically, emotionally. One is that her father commits suicide when she's 13 years old, which is devastating, as you imagine that it might be. Eerily, her father commits suicide the same way that Ernest Hemingway's father will later commit suicide, and exactly the same way that Ernest himself will commit suicide in 1961. We're about to come up on the 50-year anniversary of Hemingway's suicide this summer. The other thing that happens to Hadley is when she's 6 years old, she falls out of the second-story window of her nursery and injures her back to the degree that her family wonders if she'll ever walk again. And even when she does, she goes on to make a complete recovery. Her family believes that she's fragile. She's fragile and she needs to be protected. Poor Hadley, don't overexert yourself. Her friends learn, to swim and run and play, and Hadley does none of those things. She's a quiet, reserved girl who mostly lives in her imagination through books. And then what happens in the summer of 1920 is that her mother grows very seriously ill, and Hadley nurses her on her deathbed. And when her mother passes, I believe that Hadley, for the first time in 28 years, believes that she might have another life altogether. So it's no coincidence that when a very good friend of hers, a childhood friend from school, writes and says, "You need to take your mind off this tragedy. Please come to Chicago. You can stay at my brother's house. I'll show you a really good time." Hadley says yes, and she goes to a party that night, her very first night in Chicago. And who does she meet at that party? She meets young Hemingway at that party. And again, I don't believe that it's an accident at all, because right at that moment, she was ready to say yes to life. And who better to show her life than young Mr. Hemingway, who, for those who knew him at the time, believed that he was more alive than anyone else, that he really did life all the way up and through. He was wildly charismatic, he was magnetic, he was electric, he was electrifying, he was ready to devour the world. Even though, as I've said, very little had happened to him on the writing front, a lot had happened to him on the living front. So he had just turned 21 when these two meet. Hadley's 28, almost 29. He's just turned 21, so this is a big difference in age group, in their ages. So she's a bit of a cougar, right, Hadley? And everybody loves that story. They're like, she's 8 years older, he must have married his mother. But in fact, I think Hadley could not be more different from Grace Hemingway. So Ernest is just 21, but a couple of really important things happen to him too, which I think prepare him to meet Hadley in an extraordinary way. I think of these two young lovers kind of careening toward each other across time and space, and they're fated to meet. They're absolutely fated to meet. So when he's a very young man, when Ernest is 18 years old, he goes off to World War I. He really wants to be a soldier, as many young men do, and yet his eyesight kind of prevents him from being a candidate for a soldier. So he volunteers for the Red Cross to drive an ambulance. He goes to the Italian front, and just a few weeks later, he's near fatally wounded, which is really important in his biography and his emotional makeup. An 18-year-old boy, believes he's invincible and that he's going to live forever. And so from this moment forward, he has a very complicated relationship to bravery and to fear. And really, we know it as PTSD now. At the time, they said shell shock. He was shell-shocked, and he remained so, really, for the rest of his life. It absolutely altered him psychologically and emotionally. The other thing that happens to Ernest as a young man is he goes off to Milan to recover from his war wounds and very famously falls in love with Agnes von Kurowski, who is his war nurse. And if you've read A Farewell to Arms, right? You know that he immortalizes that relationship, Hemingway does, with Agnes von Kurowski. The thing that is important about Agnes, too, though, is that she is a flibbertigibbet. She is a bit of a flake. And so he's falling madly, madly in love with Agnes. And she professes to love him as well, when really on the side, she's not at all serious. So he goes home thinking he's ready. He's sending out the wedding invitations. Young Hemingway is a very romantic young man and incredibly sentimental. He goes back to Oak Park, and what does he get in the mail? A Dear Ernest letter. He gets a Dear Ernest letter, and Agnes has fallen in love with someone else, and he's completely devastated. And of course, again, he's shell-shocked. He's been wounded physically, now he's been wounded emotionally. The very fabric of the world is dissolving under his feet. What can he trust at all? So when I was doing my research, I found a lot of his letters, but also their love letters. And they're open to the public. They're available in Boston at the John F. Kennedy Memorial Library. So I went there mostly to find Hadley. I wanted to live with her voice. I wanted to hang out with her, you know, if that makes sense, and really get an interior look at her life. Surprisingly, though, I mean, there I am surrounded by all of his papers, all of his work in manuscript form. It was too delicious. So I picked up a box very early in my time at the library, and the first thing I picked up was a letter that he wrote to a very good friend of his on the day that Agnes von Kurowski breaks his heart. And I'm just going to read you a little excerpt from that letter. It kills me. So this is Ernest. From Ag this morning. She doesn't love me, Bill. She takes it all back. A mistake, one of those little mistakes, you know. Oh, Bill, I can't kid about it, and I can't be better because I'm just smashed. And I started to cry. I did. I mean, I might be a little squishy, too. You know, maybe a little emotional. I'm a creative personality. And yet, what really struck me by this letter was there's no ego and there's no artifice. He's just a boy, and he's had his heart broken like any other young man. And it wasn't this Hemingway up here, but this very real and human and vulnerable, devastated young man. And from that moment forward, it really changed my mind about him. And I think I began to be open to learning about him in the same way that I was learning about her. So I'm just going to read you just a few pages from very early in the book and say just a little bit more and then open it up to questions. Can everybody hear me, by the way? Is this okay? So this is Hadley, October 1920. The very first thing he does is fix me with those wonderfully brown eyes and say, "It's possible I'm too drunk to judge, but you might have something there." It's October 1920 and jazz is everywhere. I don't know any jazz, so I'm playing Rachmaninoff. I can feel a flush beginning in my cheeks from the hard cider my dear pal Kate Smith has stuffed down me, so I'll relax. I'm getting there, second by second. It starts in my fingers, warm and loose, and moves along my nerves, rounding through me. I haven't been drunk in over a year, not since my mother fell seriously ill, and I've missed the way it comes with its own perfect glove of fog, settling snugly and beautifully over my brain. I don't want to think, and I don't want to feel either, unless it's as simple as this beautiful boy's knee inches from mine. The knee is nearly enough on its own, but there's a whole package of a man attached, tall and lean, with a lot of very dark hair and a dimple in his left cheek you could fall into. His friends call him Hemingstein, Owen Bones, Bird, Nesto, Wemmage, anything they can dream up on the spot. He calls Kate Stutt, or Buttstein, not very flattering. and another fellow Little Fever, and another Horny or the Great Horned Article. He seems to know everyone, and everyone seems to know the same jokes and stories. They telegraph punchlines back and forth in code, lightning fast and wisecracking, and I can't keep up. But I don't mind, really. Being near these happy strangers is like a powerful transfusion of good cheer. When Kate wanders over from the vicinity of the kitchen, he points his perfect chin at me and says, "What should we name our new friend?" "Hash," Kate says. "Hashadad's better," he says. "Hasavich." "And your bird?" I ask. "Wem," Kate says. I'm the fellow who thinks someone should be dancing. He smiles with everything he's got, and in very short order, Kate's brother Kenley has kicked the living room carpet to one side and is manning the Victrola. We throw ourselves into it, dancing through a stack of records. He's not a natural, but his arms and legs are free in their joints, and I can tell that he likes being in his body. He's not the least shy about moving in on me either. In very short order, our hands are damp and clenched, our cheeks close enough so that I can feel the very real heat of him, and that's when he finally tells me his name is Ernest. I'm thinking of giving it away, though. Ernest is so dull. And Hemingway? Who wants a Hemingway? Probably every girl between here and Michigan Avenue, I think, looking at my feet to keep from blushing. When I look up again, he has his brown eyes locked on me. Well, what do you think? Should I toss it out? Maybe not just yet. A slow number starts, and without asking, he reaches for my waist and scoops me toward his body, which is even better up close. His chest is solid, and so are his arms. I rest my hands on them lightly as he backs me around the room, past Kenley cranking the Victrola with glee, past Kate giving us a long and curious look. I close my eyes and lean into Ernest, smelling bourbon and soap, damp cotton and tobacco, and everything about this moment is so sharp and so lovely. I do something completely out of character, and I just let myself have it. So that's Hadley. So if you've only seen the late Hemingway, what you might not know is that he was gorgeous. Like not a little bit gorgeous, like crazy, drop dead, stop you right on the street, gorgeous. So we get what Hadley was attracted to in him, right? I mean, he's alive and he's stunning and he's ready to take the world on. What does he see in her? What does he see in her? She's a simple, quiet, reserved girl from St. Louis. She is lovely enough, but not a stunner. So how does she hook him? And from the very beginning, I mean, he later said from the moment she walked into the room, he knew he was going to marry that girl. So how does she do this? I actually believe it has everything to do with the life that he's already lived. If Hadley has been careening toward this moment and is ready for the first time to say yes to life, Ernest has already lived a little too much and doesn't trust anything or anyone. He's been near killed. He's had his heart broken. So what appeals to him about Hadley, and absolutely what allows him to fall in love with this young woman, is that she's real. She's absolutely real. She's a straight shooter. She says what she means, and she means what she says. He knows she won't disappear or dissolve on him. She is not a flibberty-gibbet. She's a real person. He later says, with you by my side, I think I can do anything. I think I can write a novel. And I want to start with real people just talking to each other and saying what they really mean. And I believe that he thinks he can do this because he's met Hadley. And when he begins to really write a novel and to write stories, I actually, when I read the dialogue, particularly between men and women, I actually see Ernest and Hadley talking to one another. So I just want to give you a little taste of her voice as I found it in letters, because I've given you a little taste of his voice. So as I said, I went and did this research, and I was able to live with her and believe that I could access her consciousness. It's because her voice really leapt off the page at me. So here's Hadley, right after they meet in 1921. I wish I were with you tonight, for I could talk and talk. Sometimes, most often, I want to listen to you, trying and of course really doing it so adorably to give me a look in on all the things that make you happy and sad and gay and marveling. I hear them all out of your great big square head. Don't I, dear? Don't you love her? I love her. Your great big square head. Don't I, dear? I think it's true that you have lots of blind believing, as you call it. I think it's a most lovely thing, intuition. Inside, dead sure stuff, and it'll get to be more and more. I love you in that part of you. And then I get it. I get that Ernest is receiving these letters, and they have 11 months of courtship after the moment that they meet, and they really rip up the postal lines between St. Louis, where she's living, and Chicago, where he's living. Thousands of pages of love letters. Can you imagine getting love letters from Ernest Hemingway, maybe 2 and 3 a day? She has some anxiety because Ernest is too attractive to others. She later said that everyone was attracted to Ernest, men and women and children and dogs. Absolutely everyone. So in order to fall in love with him, she has to take this incredible risk, and yet she does it because he represents life, and she really wants that. So they're married in September of 1921. They go to Chicago, and they live in this dingy, dreary, third-floor walk-up on North Dearborn Street. And I know that it's dingy and dreary because I've read her letters. And when I was in Chicago a couple months ago, I'm saying this dingy, dreary, third-floor walk-up on North Dearborn Street. And in the Q&A, a gentleman stands up and he's like, well, you know that dingy, dreary, third-floor walk-up on North Dearborn Street? I own that building. And then because he's very generous, he says, would you like a tour? And I say, yes, yes, I would like a tour. And in fact, I was able to go, and oh my goodness, time had not passed at all. I mean, it really must have looked like very much what she saw it, looking like in 1921. It was dingy, and it was dreary, and the bathroom's down the hall, and there's no running water, and it's 2 little rooms, and a shelf where the Murphy bed, pulled out from. And I just thought, oh, poor Hadley. Poor Hadley, what did you get yourself into, sister? But they weren't there for very long. He wants to go back to Italy. He wants to go to Rome and write fiction. And around this time, they meet the writer Sherwood Anderson, who's in Chicago. And he says, Rome is Rome. It's fabulous. But if you want to make anything, you need to move to Paris. Paris is where it's at. But they don't have 2 dimes to rub together, these 2 young lovers. And then 2 things happen. One is that an uncle of hers dies and leaves her $8,000 inheritance, which is like $1 million in 1921. And then he starts to write as a correspondent for the Toronto Star. And off they go to Paris in December of 1921, and it changes both of their lives forever. And that's really the majority of my book, sort of in Paris in the 1920s, which was a spectacular time, a truly amazing time. There's F. Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda, and Ezra Pound, and Gertrude Stein. There's Picasso walking down the street. I mean, you start to think there must have been something in the water, right? And yet it was absolutely delicious to live there, excuse me, and to be invited into these cafes with these quintessential writers, and it was extraordinary. So thank you so much. That's what I have prepared. And I think we have a few minutes to take questions, if there is questions. So you had a question? No? No? No. Can you shout?
I was just wondering how daunting you were to take on a character
Right. So the question is, wasn't I daunted by taking on Ernest Hemingway and a character that about whom so much is already known? And the answer is absolutely. Absolutely. I think ignorance is bliss, though. I'd never written a historical novel before. I didn't really know all the ways that I would be schooled kind of along the way. And because, as I said, I was just swept away by the love story, in the end I began to tell myself that really it just happens to be about Ernest Hemingway. It's really the story of a marriage, the rise and fall of a marriage, and how these young lovers who were so meant for one another kind of lost each other along the way. How does that happen, and then how do they begin to recover? And I kind of focused on the story and the emotional interior of these characters, which in the end are like any other two young people in love, right? And could forget about all this other business, at least for a short time. Yeah.
So we just finished your book in my book club on Thursday, and the big bone of contention was the beliefs. Explanation you have about the beliefs, and we actually weren't buying it.
So the question is, so Hadley is the wife who's very famous for losing a valise with Ernest's work, 3 years worth of his work, is lost on a train, and it never showed up again. Some people wonder, is it going to turn up on Antiques Roadshow or on Craigslist sometime? But she loses this work, and the explanation that I give is the part that you don't believe is that she didn't mean to do it. Right. And most biographers think, how could she possibly have done it? I mean, what kind of airhead would step off a train and go get an Evian water and something to read when Ernest Hemingway's work is sitting here in this case? But remember, he wasn't Ernest Hemingway. He was just her husband, squirreling off to cafes and writing on scraps of paper and napkins and squirreling them away in these little caches all over the place. I believe that their marriage never recovered, though, from that moment on. If Ernest needs to believe that Hadley is absolutely reliable and dependable, and she's the ground that he walks on and supports him and anchors him to the earth, from that moment on, he begins to wonder if he really can trust her. It was a terrible, terrible mistake that continues to echo through time. Maybe one more question, and then we'll move on. Is there one more question? Yeah. So the question is, how do I feel about the restored edition of A Moveable Feast? So just a few years ago, a year and a half ago, Ernest's grandson decides he's going to reissue A Moveable Feast and correct the over-shaping or editing that Ernest's fourth wife, Mary, has done along the way. And something about the shaping or the editorial process of the original A Moveable Feast seemed wrong to Patrick, his son, and to Sean, the grandson. Mostly they believe that Pauline is made out to be a much crueler, more manipulative person than she actually was. I think because he never finished this book, we'll never know what he intended. We'll never know what he intended. So we have two versions now that are in conversation. The one thing I'll say about the restored edition is it's not as shapely as the first version. It doesn't really read like a novel. For instance, it ends with this terrible anecdote that people wonder about F. Scott Fitzgerald wondering about his penis size. Can you really end a book on the story about F. Scott Fitzgerald's anxiety about his physical self? I mean, isn't that terrible? Wouldn't an editor have said along the way, like, by the way, you can't do that? And also, I think it's a little strange for Patrick and Sean to work so hard to exonerate Pauline in the introduction and in the preface. And doesn't that make it seem a little too personal and not like a literary endeavor? So I think it's great that we have both of these books and we can make up our minds for ourselves. Anyway, thank you so much for coming today.